Module 2. Describing situational characteristics of register and genres. Introduction. In the last module, we defined a register as a language variety associated with a particular situations of use and introduced the three major components of registers analysis: the situation characteristics, the pervasive linguistic features, and the communicative function that explain why the linguistic features occurs in the situational context. In the present module, we focus on the situation, that is, in how to describe characteristics related to the situation of use, or what we call situational characteristics. These characteristics includes the physical context such as the actual time and place, but also many other considerations. For example, situational characteristics to face-to-face conversation, which include the fact that there are two more particular producing language in the spoken words and interacting directly with the another in a shared place and time. The situational characteristics of the news report are very different, with a single author producing language in the written mode for a large number of readers scattered across different places and time. An analysis situational characteristics is important, the general perspective as well as the general perspective, and most of the issues discussed in this module related to both. In contrast, style variation is independent of the situational context and thus will not address the perspective in this module. This module begins by discussing two issues related to the identification of registers and genres. First, how these text varieties can be described at different registers and genres. First, how these text varieties can be described at different levels of generality. And second, cultural distinction among registers, genres. We then develop a framework for analyzing situational characteristics, providing a templates that you can use for your own register genre analysis. Module 3 builds on the framework describing the next steps in the process, the analysis of linguistic features, and the integration of the linguistic and situational analysis through the process of functional interpretation. Issues the identifications of register genres. Before analyzing the situational characteristics of the text varieties, you must, of course, identify the variety that you want to investigate. Two issues are especially important here: recognizing the level of generality of different registers and genres, and appreciating the role of culture in identifying registers and genres. General and specialized registers and genres. In the module 1, we introduced the idea that registers can be more or less specialized. For example, conversation is one of the most generally spoken registers with relatively few specific registers. Two or more participants interacting directly with one another in the spoken mode. Telephone conversation is more specified because each participant must be communicating via an electronic channel and do not actually share the same physical place. Family dinner table conversation is even more specified with a particular settings, particular set of participants, and particular topics that are typically discussed. Speech or public speaking is another example of very general spoken register with many more specialized sub-registers such as sermons, political speech, academic lecture, and etc. It is similarly possible to distinguish among general and specialized register within writing. For example, academic prose is very general registers that characterized as written language that has been carefully produced and edited, addressed to a large number of readers who are separated in time and space from the author, and with a primary communicative purpose of presenting information about the same topic, some topic. But there are many more specialized written academic register. The distinction between textbooks and the academic research books involves the intended audience, students versus the other professionals, and more the specific communicative purposes. Example given: introducing surveying in academic fields versus presenting the results of a news research project, similar to the academic research books. And research articles in the academic journal are also written for other professionals but also focus on the results of a specific study that are also important registers difference among the academic disciplines. For example, if psychology research article is different from a chemistry research article, and both are different from history research articles, see module 6. In the in the fact that the research articles of the some academic disciplines, even more specific subregisters can identify. For more example, since science research articles typically have four sections: introduction, methods, result, discussion. The method section is quite different from the introduction or discussion section. The method section focuses especially on the descriptions of the procedures and materials in the use of in study, while the introduction and discussion section presents more general surveys of a previous research and discuss and bordered motivations and implications of the study. As you will see in this module 6, specific communicative differences like this result is systematic, registers difference also associated with different sets of linguistic features. It is important to recognize that there is no single right level for registers analysis. Rather, situational characteristics and linguistic features can be analyzed for general registers or a very specific registers, and an investigation may even start with a general registers and then shift to analyzing the more specific subregisters with it. There will be more variation among texts with general registers than a specific subregisters, and so the linguistic analysis of a general registers will need to be based on a larger sample of text. When analyzing the situation of a specific subregisters, more characteristic can be definitely specified for a very specific registers, while general registers will have more variability for certain categories. For example, for the general registers of conversation, it is not possible to identify communicative purpose or specific characteristic of the participants, in contrast of the possible to be more specific in the situational descriptions of workplace conversation among college or dinner table conversation among family members. However, as Module 4 to 10 shows, linguistic differences can be functionally associated with the situational characteristic when registers are specified at any level of generality, while, while registers differences can be regarded as a continuum of variation. Genre differences are more discrete. Further, genre are not as easily analyzed along hierarchy of generality. For example, it makes sense to describe the genre of the scientific research article identifying the linguistic conversation to use structured text. However, it is not useful to try to describe a more general genre of academic writing, since there are not general conversation used to structure the difference kind of text that could be included in that category. Similarly, a specific spoken variety like sermons delivered in Lutheran churches can be described from a general perspective, but it's unlikely that the sermon of all type would share general gender conversation, and general textual category of a public speaking could certainly not describe from a gender perspective. At the same time, that there are cases where a gender is embedded in a larger genre. For example, introductory section in scientific research article can be analyzed as genre in its own conversational structure. From this perspective, the entire introductory section would be regarded as a complete text. These texts represent the genre of introduction because they conform to the expected conventional organization, first reviewing previous research, then identifying a gap in a previous research, and many stating how the present study fill that the gap. At the same time, research article introduction are embedded in a larger genre of scientific research article, which has its own conventional conventional structure, is typically being organized as abstract introduction, methods, result, discussion, culturally recognized registers, genre. In many cases, general registers can have a short, simple names, while more specialized text text varieties have longer, more complex names. For example, conversation includes many different specialized kinds of interaction, but those are often referred to with longer names like telephone conversation, workplace conversation among college, etc. However, speakers sometimes employ short, simple names for specialized text varieties. For example, a syllabus is a specialized variety used only in school context to describe the content of the course and set out the study's expectation. A legal document that grants right to the some property of a privilege that the fact that these specialized text varieties have simple names indicates that they are widely recognized within English-speaking cultures as distinctive varieties that serve important functions. Genres generally have simple names in a culture, but this is not always in the case for registers. That is, genres are involved to specific convention generally recognized by members of a culture, and so the genre itself named within the culture. These same varieties can also be analyzed from a register perspective, and we would use the same name. However, can also be analyzed from a register's perspective, and it is not the case that all registers have simple names. For example, workplace conversation among college describe a text variety that occur in a particular use of, and among there are linguistic features functionally associated with a situation. Thus, this variety can be analyzed from a register's perspective, even though it is not present a well-defined genre. Further, not all text varieties with a simple name can be regarded as genres. For example, sermons and lecture might be regarded as specialized subject registers of speeches, or the general registers of public speaking, but we would not to consider specific types of sermons to be able to apply the general perspective. For example, it is unlikely that a sermon delivered by a Roman Catholic priest will have the same general conventions as a sermon delivered by a Southern Baptist preacher. Similarly, conversation describes a very general registers, but conversation are not clearly structured by a general convention. In some cases, a very specialized domain has a multiple general registers that are familiar to experts in the fields, but not generally familiar that the public. For example, that the legal domain includes generous registers such as affidavit, deposition, and pleading. The legal government domain includes treaties, regulation, laws, and ordinance. In the religious domain, there are prayer, benediction. That eulogies here again, the use of a simple name indicates that these benedictions and eulogies are varieties are overtly recognized by a member of the subculture as representing meaningful distinction, even though they may not be known by the other outside the subculture. It is normal for a culture to make gender register the distinction that are not recognized in the other culture. For example, Durante 1994 describes the different kinds of speeches that occur during the course of a phono in Western Samoa. English speakers would probably recognize the phono as a kind of village council to discuss political and judiciary matters. However, there are many speeches given in a phono, and it is unlikely that an English speaker would perceive those to be different registers for a speaker of Samoa. However, the speeches given during a phono fall into several distinct genre registers categories, including Noga, the main ceremonial speech, Tali replies, Talanoa discussion. In addition, there are distinct genres within a loga, including the Falasoga, introduction, and data Thanksgiving. A second example of the importance of a culture in general registers identification comes from a Basas 1990 one for the following descriptions of oral storytelling among the Western Pakke for different kinds of stories are distinguished. Goji Go Nagoldi, creation stories told by a medicine men and women to enlighten and instruct about how universe came to be the way of its Agodachi, historical moral story about even events that took place a long time ago, before the arrival of Europeans, intended to emphasize the importance of proper behavior and the bad consequences of improper behavior. Igor Nagoldy, stories about events that occurred within a past several decades told to a certain listeners. They are members of the Western Apache community who are currently living in the community. In this case, members of English-speaking culture in the USA and the UK would recognize all of these as stories. They would probably be able to describe the major differences in the stories, but those differences are not especially important in many English-speaking cultures except for gossip, which widely recognized as distinctive type of story. As a result, where members of a Western Apache culture regard these as a four different genres registers. Most members of Anglo culture would recognize only one or two genres registers, simply stories or stories versus gossip. Often members of a culture distinguish two different registers primarily by their communicative purpose, while a physical circumstances might appear to be merely communicative purpose, while physical circumstances might appear to be nearly identical to the casual outside observer. For example, the registers of Tas, tafsir and wad in Arabic speaking Islamic cultures might both perceive as sermons by a casual outside observer, but are monologic registers performed by a sheikh as a part of a religious ceremony in mosque, but differ in the primary communicative purpose. The tafsir is more informal and explanatory, presenting content from the Quran and Hadith and explaining its meaning. In a contrast, the word is more persuasive and exhortatory, encouraging audience members to devote and practice the precepts of religion. Normally, the two registers occur in a sequence that Sheikh would first quote a passage from the Quran or Hadith, then move on the tafsir, explaining the contents of the passage, and finally present what a discussion of the particular implication of the passage, an encouragement to act in a certain ways on those implications. These same kinds of language are common in what an English speaker would recognize a sermon. However, in many Arabic speaking cultures, the two are recognized as distinct registers. All three of the above examples illustrate how gender registers distinction are culture specific. Furthermore, even when two cultures have seemingly equivalent genres registers, they can turn to be different because they have distinctive communicative purpose. For example, both American English and Somali cultures have general registers used for a personal written communication sent by surface mail from an individual to another. The personal letter in American English and the wargad in Somali. Until recently, such texts were relatively common in each of these two cultures. More current letters have come to be more replaced by electronic communicative in many cultures. Although these two genres registers are similar in many respects, they differ in their typical communicative purposes. Personal letters in American English are usually written for a general impersonal communication to maintain a relationship and inform the address about the recent personal event in the author life. In a contrast, Bargad in Somali, usually written because the writer needs something from the address. These differences have important linguistic consequences. Wargad contain many distinctive statements that tell the address that they should do using grammatical features like imperatives and optative clause, which express wishes. In a contrast, personal letter in American English contain many questions asking the address about their circumstances and first-person instance construction telling the personal circumstances of the writer. In summary, different cultures have different ways of dividing up the range of activities. that are performed using a language. One culture might perceive relatively small differences in a purpose to be the manifestations of different registers and or genres, while another culture could perceive the same range of communicative events to all represents a single genre register. Further, the same genre register in two cultures can actually be characterized by important differences in purpose or other situational characteristics. Therefore, the first step in conducting an analysis is to identify the described and situational characteristics. The framework for situational analysis effectively registers analysis are always comparative in a impossible to know what is distinctive about a particular registers without campaigning into another register. So, for example, Cooper Hago 1984 described the register characteristics of livestock auction by comparison to the more general registers of oral poetry and conversation. There are a few register studies that focus exclusively on a single register, such as Ferguson 1983 description of sports announcer talk, or Bruchak's 1996 description of classified advertisement in the cases. The researchers relies on these intuitions and previous experience with the other registers to identify the distinctive characteristics of the target registers. This is not a recommended practice because there are a number of sources of information that can help you describe situation characteristics of a register. The importance of each of the sources below will differ depending on how involved you are with the culture groups that recognize these registers and how much experience you have with the registers yourself. Furthermore, some of the characteristics will be easy to analyze based on your own experience, while others will require more research. For example, it is no problem to tell your own observation whether a register is spoken or written, even if you have no previous experience with it. Determining the communicative purpose of a register may require more primary research. If you are part of the cultural group that uses registers and have a personal experience producing the registers effectively, your own knowledge can be one major source of information that you use for the situational analysis. However, even in this case, it will require some thinking and discussion with the other members of the cultural groups to be confident about your interpretation. For example, since you have had many experience engaging in a conversation with friends, you could list the situational characteristics of the register without consulting any other sources. Having also read many textbooks, you could probably describe situational characteristics of that registers, including some of the variability in purpose, such as how entertaining versus purely informative particular textbooks are. However, observers or novices in professional domain generally cannot fully describe the registers identified by practitioners in the domain. For example, academic professionals make many fine distinction among the various kinds of published articles, including research articles, reviews, articles, books, reviews, and commentaries. Academic professionals also distinguish among the various venues for a published articles, including referred research journals, non-referred journals, newsletters, a chapter in the edited book to casual observer and novices. All the registers are simple published articles, thus many analysis requires additional information beyond what you can obtain from your own experience. When you don't have a great deal of experience with a registers, asking expert informations about it can help you identify its situational characteristics. To continue with the academic example above, if you were describing academic research articles, interviewing your professors about the characteristics of a particular subregisters would be invaluable. Of course, individuals vary in their perceptions, so it always helpful speak with several informants that the expert's informants is even more important. If you are describing registers used in a culture that is not your own native culture, because it's unlikely that an outside in a culture is not yours or own native culture, because it is unlikely that an outside observer will fully understand the cultural significance of communication events. It is a natural interpret such as a relative to the register's distinctions that you recognize your own native culture. In this case, the expert's native information is essential to help you recognize the register's distinctions found in the target culture. Previous research is also a good potential source of information about the situational characteristics. For example, studies from a rhetorical perspective can help you understand how registers is used within this cultural context. To continue our examples from above, if you were studying scientific research articles previously published, cases studies and professional writers in science and could help you understand the purposes and audiences of the registers example given, such as the early studies done by Baseman 1988 and Latour and Woolgar 1986. Be relevant for some comparison, but applying the framework can help you think through the full sets of situational characteristics that needs to be considered. Table 2.1 lists the major situational characteristics that are relevant for describing and comparing registers and genres. These characteristics were compiled. Number 1, participants. A, addressors, speaker or author, singular, plural, institution, and unified. 2, social characteristics, example given, age, education, professions. B, address, singular, plural, and enumerated. 2, self, others. C, are there onlookers. Number 2, relations among participants. A, interactiveness. B, social roles, relative status or power. C, personal relationship, example given, friends, college, stranger. D, shared knowledge, personal specialist. 3, channel. A, modes of speech writing, signing. B, specific medium, permanent, example given, tape, transcribed, printed, handwritten, email, transient, example given, face, telephone, radio, TV. 4, processing circumstances, a production's real-time, planned, scripted, revised, and edited. B, comprehension's real-time, scheming, careful reading. 4, 5, settings. A, are the time and place of communication shared by participants. B, place of communications. 1, private, public. 2, specific settings. C, time, contemporary, historical time period. 6, communicative purpose. A, general purpose. Example given, narrate, report, describe, inform, explain, interpret, persuade, how to, procedural, entertain, identify, edify, reveal self. B, specific purpose. Example given, summarize information from a numerous source, describes methods, presents new research findings, teach more through personal story. C, pur- purported punctuality, factual opinion, speculative, imaginative, the expressions, for instance, systematic, attitudinal, do, overt instance. 7, the general topic domain, example given, domestic, daily activities, business, workplace, science, education, academic, government, legal, politics, religion, sports, art, entertainment. B, specific topic, social status of person being referred to. Cases of addresses, for example, it is possible to specify yourself in a variety general sense. Lists of individuals who listen to a radio broadcast or television show published written registers provide even clearer examples of registers with an enumerated set of address. For example, a novel can exist physical for years or even centuries, and there is no obvious way to identify who the sets of readers will be over that time. Finally, the situational context for some registers includes a group of onlookers. These are participants who observe but are not the direct addresses of the registers. For example, actors in dramatic plays are conversing address one another on the stage, but the entire conversation interacts. But the entire conversation interaction observe audience of similarly participants in a debate or during a courtroom testimony directly address one another, but they are also aware of the audience of onlookers. In fact, the role of the onlookers might have more practical importance than the address. For example, during the court testimony, a witness directly addressing an examining attorney, but the major purpose of the witness is directly addressing examining attorney, but the purpose of communications is to persuade a group onlookers that the jury in case like this, the distinction between the address and onlookers is somewhat fuzzy. The most important point of registers analysis is that you recognize the influence of both. When you have identified the participant, the next step is to describe how they relate to one another. The most important considerations here is the interactiveness. To what extent do the participants directly interact with one another? At one extreme, there is a registered live conversation where all participants are present and able directly respond to one another. At the opposite extreme, our registers is university catalogs because it is very difficult to even identify the exact authors of this text. Is virtually impossible to have an interactive dialogue with the authors. More registers are immediately in their degree interactiveness. For example, participants in an email interchange directly responds to one another, but what interaction can be spread over days and weeks. A university class sessions will normally be interactive, but not equally for all participants. Rather, the instructor will typically produce more of the language and control the extent of which the authors is not easily accessible to the address response of. However, readers can post comments on online sites, allowing for a limited kinds of interactions. Authors sometimes respond to such comments, resulting in interaction between the original addressor and the particular address. However, it is more common for a multiple address for post comments which often directly address issues raised in the post by previous address. Thus way, the commenting becomes an embedded interactive subregisters with the readers interacting with one another rather than with the original authors. In addition, the extends interactiveness it is more important to consider the social roles and personal relationship among participants. In many cases, participants can be socially equally as in the case of the two classmates having a conversation, but in other cases, there are more important social differences among the participants. For example, the power differences can be influence a language choice even in a casual conversation. If you're taking to your teacher or boss, you probably use different language than when you talk to your best friends. Participants can also have the different degrees of shared background knowledge. For example, imagine have a different degrees of shared background knowledge. For example, imagine how you would describe your interactiveness this past weekend when you taking to your roommate who knows most of your friends and the places where you like to go in a comparison to how would you describe those activities to a stranger. Speaker can also share specialized background knowledge. Imagine discussing a linguistic analysis with one of your classmates contrasted with how you would describe the same analysis to your parents. Written text can also differ depending on the specialist shared knowledge. For example, an academic research journal has an articles addressed to other specialists in the fields, while introductory textbooks are addressed to novices in the fields. One of the most obvious differences among the register is the physical channel or mode. Speech versus writing. It turns out the difference between speech and writing intertwined with other situational characteristics. For example, registers produced in the spoken mode almost always have a specific addressor and typically have a specific address. In a contrast, written registers can have situational addressor and an enumerated address. The spoken registers are often interactive. Written registers are rarely interactive. Spoken and written registers also differ in written registers are rarely interactive. Spoken and written Written registers also differ in their typical production circumstances and even their typical communicative purposes. See below for all of these reasons and distinctions between a spoken and written registers is one of the most important institutional parameters for this linguistic description of registers. As we show in the following modules, of course, not all registers are spoken or written. There are other specialized modes of communication. Signing, in particular, is a fully developed mode of communication, while there are also much more restricted modes like jump talk or smooth signal. However, in the present course, we restrict ourselves to the descriptions of spoken and written registers. It is also possible to distinguish among specific mediums of communication within speech or writing, such as telephone or radio speech and handwriting, electronic and printed, or for in writing. These more specific means of expressing language can also have an influence on the linguistic forms that the speakers employ. Example given the discussion of electronic interpersonal registers in Module 7. The settings refer to the physical context of communication, the time and a place. An important consideration here is whether the time and place are shaped. In many spoken registers, the participants share the physical context and they can directly refer to with words like yesterday or here. Such a situation-dependent reference is not appropriate in most written registers where the participants do not share the same time or place. However, some written texts do assume that the readers has knowledge of time and sometimes place of productions. For example, the news reports may text its mean to be read the day it was produced. Personal email messages and text is meant to be the read the day it was produced. Personal email message and text message generally assume even greater of, of time and place production. In addition, there are general characteristics of the settings that can be important. For example, is the place of the communication private? Example, given conversation texting or public. Example, given classroom teaching textbooks. Both private and public communication can occur in almost any particular settings. For example, it is possible to have the private conversation with a friend as well as the public conversation with a customer in the exact same physical location at a work. Written text may have a specific settings by being published as a part of a larger document, such as a module within a course. Furthermore, the title of the communication can be relatively contemporary of or a historical time period. All of the situational characteristics consideration is an aspect of the text context, who is participating, where they are, what physical mode of communication is being, and the production circumstances are. However, it is equally important to consider that why or the why of the communication. The communicative purpose can be described on several different levels. It is usually possible to identify the general purpose of registers, such as narrating or reporting past events, describing some states of such as narrating affairs, explaining or interpreting informations, arguing or persuading, providing procedural informations about how to perform certain activities, entertaining the address, and revealing personal feelings or attitudes. However, text and sub-registers also often have distinct specific purposes. In some cases, the subparts of a single text can represent distinct subregisters, each with their own particular communicative purposes. For example, as noted in section 221, typical scientific research article will be composed of four distinct sections that are explicitly labeled: introduction, methods, result, discussion, IMRD. These sections can be regarded as such as subregisters, differing mostly in their specific communicative purpose. Introductions describe the current state of knowledge in the fields and might include some narrations of past events or some explanation of concepts or previous research findings. Then the method sections will switch procedural communicative purpose, describing how the study was conducted. Result sections are usually descriptive, stating what was found in the study, while the discussion section is usually more interpretative, explanatory, and persuasive. All of these articles action have the same physical context, the same author, same readers, same production circumstances, etc. But there are important linguistic differences across article sections associated with the shapes. In the specific communicative purpose, some texts combine several communicative purposes and thus they can be regarded by hybrids. For example, textbooks usually combine descriptive and explanatory purpose. Textbooks in engineering disciplines will also include procedural information, while textbooks in humanities will often include persuasive discussion and some narratives. Further, it is possible to switch purpose in the middle of communicative events. For example, you might be having a conversation with a friend where you are discussing political candidates, describing a specific candidate endorser, and trying to persuade your friend that a particular candidate is the most qualified. In this case, you would be describing the current state of affairs, but also revealing your own attitudes and also trying to persuade the listener about the correctness of your point of view. But then it would be very easy to switch purpose. For example, telling a story about the last time that you want to vote and how long you had to wait in line and how someone else in lines was behavior. This switch in purpose can be regarded as a shift in subregisters from one kind of conversation to another, similar to the changes in purpose across the IMRD. Sections of a research articles can be interpreted as shifts to distinct subregisters within the general registers of articles. However, it is more common to find text and blends multiple communicative purpose. For example, consider the following excerpts from the travel blog. The general purpose of these registers is to provide information about the bike tour. However, the general goal is to accomplish by integrating personal travel narratives with informational descriptions of the biking route. In this case, different communicative purposes are not overtly marked as distinct sections in this text, so they do not roughly correspond to the paragraphs. The first and the fourth paragraphs have the purpose of personal narrations, while the second and third, fifth paragraphs have distinctive informational purpose. In the other text, such as blending communicative purpose can be occur within the paragraphs or even within a single sentence. Thus, while it is useful to identify the primary communicative purpose of the register, it is equally important to recognize that many texts are hybrid, blending multiple communicative purposes. Author parameter relating to the purpose is purported factuality. factuality. Thus, the addresser intend to convey factual information, personal opinion, speculations, or fictions, fantasy. This parameter can be useful for distinguishing among the primary intents of a register, such as novel fictions versus a biography, factual, or a personal blog opinion versus a news report's factual, but these are not dis- discrete differences. Speaker often often mix facts and fantasy, and it might be argued that no personal account can be true or factual. In addition, there are numerous notorious examples for text that purpose to the factual but turn out to be more actually fictional. In some cases, such as speech events, would be called a lie. More recently, though such texts have sometimes been labeled fake news, a final parameter concerning the expressions of instance. This parameter includes expressions both of personal attitudes and of epistemic stance. The extent to which information is certain or generalizable or indicates the source of the information. For example, with the general registers of news reporting, there are different types of text associated with different expressions of an instance. A typical report of a news events has a title or no overt expressions of instance. It simplifies states what happened. It may still convey a certain ideology, but overt markers of instance are generally limited to statements of the source, such as according to analysis, reports of specific discoveries. On the other hand, are more concerned with expressing epistemic stance, especially the extent to which information is certain or generalizable. You would not be surprised to see information is certain or general or expressions such as it is possible that or the findings suggest or it is in general. Like the situational analysis framework in a register study, in Module 1, we presented the three major components of a register's analysis, describing the situational characteristics of the registers, 2, analyzing the typical linguistic characteristics of the registers, and 3, identify the functional forces that help to explain why those linguistic features tend to be associated with those situational characteristics, starting register analysis with a thorough descriptions of the situational characteristic can help you in several ways. For example, if you were studying a register used by a cultural group that you are not very familiar with, the situational analysis will ensure that you are not in inadvertently mixing registers that the cultural groups distinguish similarly. If you are studying a very general registers, it can be ensured that you cannot do not overlook sub-registers within it, even with the registers that you know well. Working through the characteristics in a table 2.1 will ensure that you do not disregard important situational characteristics that might be crucial in interpreting the linguistic patterns. Usually report or academic papers that describe a register's analysis, including the case studies in the modules of this course, do not discuss all the situational characteristics and distinguish among the registers, or they might focus on those characteristics that prove to be more important in interpreting the linguistic features. Nevertheless, it is important to consider all the situational characteristics during the initial analytical process and not to jump conclusion about which are the most influential.